The sun dipped low over the quiet suburban street. Blue and red lights from the police cruiser painted the houses in sharp, flashing colors. People peeked from behind curtains, whispering about the argument outside. No one dared to step closer. It was not just a normal traffic stop. Something was different tonight. The officer stood tall beside his patrol car, his hand resting on his belt. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the woman in front of him. She was dressed in a red dress under a black blazer, calm and elegant, her posture unshaken. He thought she was just another civilian to intimidate, but her silence carried a strange kind of power. It unsettled him. "License and registration," he barked, his voice sharp and cold. He didn't bother hiding the sneer curling across his lips. To him, she was beneath him. To him, her confidence was nothing more than arrogance. His tone was dripping with disdain, and the neighbors watching from their windows could feel the tension. The air was heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The woman didn't flinch. She looked at him with eyes that showed neither fear nor anger, but something else: control. She reached slowly into her purse, not for her license, not for her registration, but for something far more powerful. She pulled out a black leather badge holder. With one motion, she raised it high between them. The badge caught the light of the flashing siren. Its golden edges burned against the night. For a moment, the officer froze. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The badge spoke louder than words. Internal affairs. The seal glistened, unmistakable. It was the one thing every officer feared more than any street criminal. It meant oversight. It meant power. It meant judgment. And it meant she was not just some woman in a red dress. She was the one who could end his career with a single report. A hush fell over the street. The officer's jaw tightened. He tried to keep his face unreadable, but the corners of his mouth twitched, betraying his nerves. He had spent years throwing his weight around, mocking and belittling those he thought were powerless. But now, the power was no longer in his hands. It was standing in front of him, calm, beautiful, and unshaken. Who's in charge now? Her voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It wasn't angry, but it was final. It was the kind of voice that came from someone used to command. Someone who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. It was the voice of truth, and it echoed louder than the sirens still spinning behind them. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry. He thought of the neighbors watching. He thought of his fellow officers who might hear about this. He thought of the countless times he had laughed, mocked, and pushed people around just because he could. And now, every ounce of that false authority crumbled in seconds. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She did not raise her voice. She did not show anger. She simply stood eye to eye with him, the badge still between them. He had always believed his uniform gave him control. Now for the first time, he realized control could be stripped away. "In an instant, your actions tonight will be reviewed," she said firmly. "Every word you spoke, every gesture you made, every choice you thought no one would question, they will all be examined. And when they are, we will see if you still have a badge on your chest tomorrow." Her words were simple. No threats. No insults, just truth. And truth, in that moment, was heavier than any punishment. The officer felt his face flush. He wanted to argue, to deny, to push back, but he knew he couldn't, not against her. Not against the badge gleaming like fire in her hand. A car passed slowly down the street, its driver staring at the scene. The officer shifted uncomfortably. He wanted the ground to swallow him whole. But the woman didn't move. She held her ground, unbreakable, steady as stone. Every second that passed stripped him of the little pride he had left. Every second revealed who was really in charge. The neighbors behind their curtains whispered louder now. They didn't know her name. They didn't know her story. But they knew what they had just seen. A woman standing tall against arrogance. A woman turning humiliation into justice. A woman proving, without doubt, that true power was not in the uniform or the flashing lights, but in the courage to hold someone accountable. The officer dropped his gaze. His voice, once sharp and commanding, was now flat and quiet. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. For the first time in years, he was forced to submit. And the woman, still calm, still elegant, knew this was only the beginning. The real war was not fought on the streets tonight. It would be fought in the reports, the hearings, the places where lies couldn't hide. She was ready. And he was not. The night ended with silence. The flashing police lights faded away as the officer returned to his car, humiliated and shaken. He had thought the encounter would be another routine stop where he could throw his authority around. Instead, it became the night he learned that power could crumble in seconds. The woman's face and the gleaming badge stayed in his mind long. After he drove off, he told himself it was just a moment, a mistake, nothing to worry about. But deep down, he knew it was far from over. The woman returned to her car, calm but not careless. Her name was Angela Brooks, and she carried the weight of internal affairs on her shoulders. She had seen officers like him many times before, men who used their position as a weapon rather than a duty. But this one was different. His arrogance wasn't hidden. It was loud, sharp, and dangerous. She knew that leaving it unchecked would only feed his pride further. Tonight was not just about humiliation. Tonight was the beginning of something larger. By morning, whispers of the encounter had already spread. Neighbors talked. Witnesses shared what they had seen. Even within the station, the story moved like wildfire. "Did you hear what happened?" one officer muttered. She flashed her badge right in his face. Others laughed, others stayed quiet, but everyone knew when internal affairs stepped in, nothing was ever the same. At her office, Angela sat behind her desk, flipping through files. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ink. Her desk was stacked with case reports, misconduct complaints, and performance records. She had learned early in her career that racism within the ranks was not just about words or attitudes. It was about patterns. It was about officers who treated some people with respect and others with cruelty. She had seen careers destroyed by arrogance, and she had built her own reputation by bringing truth to light, no matter how powerful the person standing in her way was. On her desk lay a fresh file. Officer Daniel Morris, the same man who stood in front of her the night before. The report was thick, too thick for someone who claimed to serve with honor. Complaints of unnecessary force, reports of biased treatment. Even body camera footage flagged for review. She flipped through the pages slowly, her expression calm but firm. To her, this was no surprise. To her, last night had only confirmed what the paper already showed. Meanwhile, at the station, Daniel sat at his desk, his face pale. He tried to act normal, laughing at jokes, talking to colleagues, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled when he reached for his coffee. He knew what internal affairs meant. He knew once they turned their eyes on you, there was no escaping. His friends told him to shake it off, to forget about it, but his gut told him otherwise. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she said, "Your actions tonight will be reviewed." It was not a threat. It was a promise. Angela walked into the station the next afternoon. Heads turned as she entered, her red dress replaced with a sharp black suit. Every step she took echoed against the tiled floor. She carried her badge openly now, clipped neatly to her blazer. The silence followed her like a shadow. Officers, who normally laughed and joked, grew quiet. They knew who she was. They knew why she was here. Daniel tried to keep his composure when she walked past his desk. He forced a smirk, as if he was unbothered, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. Angela stopped, turned her head slightly and looked at him. Her voice was calm, steady, and unshaken. "Officer Morris, I'll be needing you in the conference room in 5 minutes." It wasn't a request. It was an order. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The entire room seemed to freeze. Every officer knew what it meant when Internal Affairs called you in. It was the kind of meeting that decided careers. It was the kind of meeting that stripped away excuses and left only truth. Inside the conference room, the air was colder. The blinds were half drawn, casting sharp lines of light across the table. Daniel sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, trying to look confident, but failing. Angela placed the thick file on the table and slid it toward him. The sound of the folder hitting the wood was louder than anything else in the room. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. He glanced down. His name was written on the cover. His stomach tightened. "Reports," he muttered. "Complaints." Angela corrected. "Patterns, records of behavior. Actions that don't line up with the oath you swore." His lips parted, ready to defend himself, but she raised her hand, silencing him. Her eyes locked on his, steady and firm. "You had the chance to do your job with honor," she continued. "But you chose arrogance, you chose cruelty. You chose to humiliate instead of protect. That ends now." Her words cut like steel. Daniel felt smaller with every second. The room seemed to shrink around him. He wanted to argue, to claim innocence, but the weight of the evidence crushed his excuses before they could form. He knew then that this was not just about one night. This was about every night he thought no one was watching, but someone had been. And now she was sitting right in front of him, holding his entire career in her hands. Angela leaned back in her chair, calm as ever. "You will answer for every action in this file, one by one. And when you do, the truth will decide whether you still wear that uniform." The war had only just begun. The station grew tense in the days that followed. What had once been a place of laughter and casual chatter now carried the weight of whispers and silence. Every officer seemed to know something was happening, but no one dared to say it out loud. Internal Affairs had a way of pulling the truth from shadows, and no one wanted to be caught standing in the wrong one. Angela Brooks worked with quiet precision. She sat in her office surrounded by folders, reports, and stacks of recorded footage. She played body camera videos late into the night, pausing and replaying the moments where Officer Daniel Morris had acted with arrogance. Each clip told a story. Each moment revealed patterns that spoke louder than excuses. She wasn't just building a case, she was exposing the truth too many wanted to ignore. The evidence painted a clear picture. Morris had a history of pulling over drivers for no reason other than skin color. His tone was always sharper, his posture always more aggressive when dealing with certain communities. He laughed with fellow officers about teaching lessons to those he stopped. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a pattern carved deep into his behavior. And Angela knew that once a pattern was proven, it was impossible to hide. Morris tried to act unfazed. He still walked the halls with his chest out and his voice loud. But cracks were forming. His so-called friends grew distant. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. Some of the officers who once backed him now whispered in corners, unwilling to stand beside a man under Internal Affairs review. His arrogance was no longer a shield. It was a weight pulling him down. One afternoon, Angela called him back into the conference room. A projector glowed against the wall, ready to show the footage she had collected. Morris sat stiffly, trying to hide his nerves. Angela pressed play. The room filled with his own voice, sharp and cruel, captured on body camera. The screen showed him pulling a driver from a car without cause, mocking him with words that now sounded far uglier than they had in the heat of the moment. "Do you see this?" Angela asked, her voice calm. Morris shifted uncomfortably. "That was taken out of context." "Out of context?" Angela leaned forward, her eyes steady. Or is this exactly who you are when you think no one is watching? The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The recording played on, showing another stop, another act of arrogance, another laugh at someone else's expense. Morris felt the walls closing in. He realized then that his uniform was no longer a symbol of power. It was evidence of every wrong step he had taken. Angela paused the video and turned to him. "This is not about one mistake, Officer Morris. This is about a pattern of abuse, a pattern that ends now." Her words struck deeper than any punishment. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening. She was simply holding a mirror up to his actions. And in that mirror, he saw what others had seen for years, but he had always denied. That night, Morris sat alone in his small apartment. For the first time in years, the silence weighed on him. His phone buzzed with messages from a few remaining friends telling him to stay strong, but their words felt empty. He thought of Angela Brooks, standing tall, unshaken, while he shrank in his own excuses. He thought of the neighbors who had watched the night she revealed her badge. And he realized something that filled him with dread. His reputation wasn't just slipping. It was collapsing. Angela, meanwhile, prepared her next steps. She drafted a formal report, gathering statements from those who had filed complaints against Morris in the past. She reached out to citizens who had been too afraid to speak. One by one, they agreed to tell their stories, emboldened by the fact that someone was finally listening. For years, their voices had been silenced by fear of retaliation. Now, with Angela leading the charge, their truth gained power. The city began to pay attention. News of an internal affairs investigation spread quietly but steadily. Rumors turned into headlines. "Officer under review for misconduct," one article read. Morris's name was not yet printed, but those in the community knew who it was about. People whispered, waited, and watched. The story was no longer about a single night. It was about years of abuse coming to light. At the next meeting, Morris sat across from Angela again, his hands trembling slightly as she slid another stack of evidence toward him. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. "This is bigger than you now. The community deserves better. The badge deserves better. And I will not let it be tarnished by your arrogance." Morris wanted to lash out, to argue, but the weight of the truth crushed him. His voice caught in his throat. He stared at the file in front of him, knowing that every page was a nail in the coffin of his career. And for the first time, he began to understand that humiliation was not the end. It was only the beginning of his downfall. The investigation was no longer a quiet storm inside the station. It had spread beyond the walls and into the city. People who had once whispered in private now spoke openly. Citizens shared their stories, their encounters, their pain. For years they had lived with the weight of unfair treatment, believing no one would listen. But now, someone was listening. Angela Brooks had opened a door, and truth was pouring through. At the community hall, a small crowd gathered for a public forum. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Mothers held their children close, older men and women stood with folded arms, and young voices demanded answers. Angela sat at the front, calm as ever, her black blazer sharp against the warm lights of the hall. The people looked to her not with fear, but with hope. She was not just an investigator now, she was their voice. One man stood up, his voice shaking. "He stopped me 3 times in 1 month. Each time he said my taillight was broken. Each time it wasn't. He just wanted to remind me of who had power." His words trembled, but the room listened. Others nodded. His story was not isolated. It was part of a pattern everyone knew, but few dared to speak. Now they spoke together. A young woman raised her hand next. Tears lined her face. "He pulled me over on my way home from work. He said I looked suspicious." Suspicious? I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I wasn't suspicious, I was tired. Her voice broke, but Angela gave her a steady nod. "You're not alone," she said softly. Those 3 words carried strength. Those 3 words turned pain into courage. Meanwhile, back at the station, Daniel Morris felt the walls tightening. Every headline, every whisper, every story dug deeper into his pride. He still wore his uniform, but it no longer carried respect. Officers avoided his gaze. The chief gave him short, cold words instead of trust. He realized something he had never considered before: authority without respect was nothing. His badge no longer gave him power. It marked him as a target. Angela compiled the testimonies, each one adding weight to the growing case. But she knew this wasn't just about paperwork. It was about the people who had been silenced. It was about restoring trust in a system that had been broken by men like Morris. She carried their words carefully, making sure none would be ignored. In every file, every report, every statement, she found the same truth: racism had lived in the shadows too long. Now it stood exposed. The next step came faster than anyone expected. The city council demanded a review. The mayor called for transparency. News reporters waited outside the station with cameras flashing, eager for the flossing. Latest development. Angela walked past them without hesitation, her face calm, her step steady. Morris, however, shrank from the lights. He tried to hide, but the cameras caught his unease. The image of his once proud posture, now replaced by nervous glances, spread across television screens and social feeds. The public saw a man stripped of pride. Inside the council chamber, the tension was sharp. Rows of officials sat behind polished desks, papers stacked high, microphones glowing red. Angela stood at the podium, presenting the evidence piece by piece. Videos, reports, testimonies. Each detail painted the same picture. Each fact cut deeper into Morris's defense. He sat at the side of the room, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, he had no authority to silence the voices against him. "This is not a single mistake," Angela said firmly, her voice carrying through the chamber. "This is a repeated abuse of authority. An abuse that targeted individuals because of who they were, not what they did. That is not law enforcement. That is prejudice wearing a badge." The words struck like thunder. The room fell silent, the officials leaning forward. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. For a moment, Morris wanted to shout, to argue, to deny everything. But the truth surrounded him. The faces in the crowd, the evidence on the screen, the calm certainty in Angela's voice, they all cornered him in a way he could not escape. One council member asked, "Do you believe he is fit to continue his service?" Angela's eyes locked on Morris. "No," she said simply. "The badge is meant to protect, not to intimidate. The uniform is meant to serve, not to humiliate. When those values are broken, the uniform means nothing." The room erupted with murmurs. Citizens nodded. Officials whispered among themselves. Morris felt the weight of every eye pressing down on him. His throat tightened. He realized that his arrogance, once his shield, was now his downfall. And standing across from him was the woman who had proved what real authority looked like. That night, the city buzzed with the news. "Officer under fire for misconduct," the headlines read. His name was no longer hidden. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew what he had done. Children asked their parents about the story. Strangers on the street shook their heads. The humiliation was complete, but Angela knew it was not the end. This was only the middle of the fight. The true decision, the one that would decide his future, was still to come. The city could no longer look away. Every headline, every broadcast, every whispered conversation carried the same story. Officer Daniel Morris was no longer seen as the loud, untouchable enforcer. He was seen as a man under fire, his pride stripped and his career hanging by a thread. His name, once spoken with respect in some circles, was now tied to shame. The weight of his own actions pressed down heavier each day. At the station, Morris tried to act as though nothing had changed. He wore his uniform, walked the halls, and forced his voice to stay strong. But every glance he received told him the truth. Officers who once stood beside him now avoided his eyes. Younger recruits who once tried to copy his swagger now whispered about his fall. He was becoming an example, not of strength, but of what happens when arrogance replaces duty. Angela Brooks, meanwhile, grew more focused. Her desk was a battlefield of papers, files, and testimonies. Each piece of evidence built a larger picture, one that could not be denied. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, she simply worked. For her, this was not about revenge or pride. It was about justice. It was about showing the city that no one, not even those with a badge, was above accountability. The day of the official hearing arrived. The chamber was full. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras blinking red, microphones aimed forward. Citizens packed the seats, their faces tense with anticipation. At the center sat the review board, a panel of officials charged with deciding Morris's fate. The air was heavy with expectation. This was not just a hearing, it was a trial of trust. Morris sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes flickering nervously. He wanted to appear strong, but his shoulders slumped under the weight of humiliation. His lawyer whispered to him, urging him to stay calm, but nothing could erase the look of fear that crept into his eyes. Across from him, Angela entered, calm and steady, her presence commanding respect without a single word. The first witness stepped forward, a young man, who described being pulled from his car late at night, accused of crimes he hadn't committed. His voice trembled, but his words rang with truth. "He looked at me like I was guilty before I even spoke," the young man said. "I still can't drive at night without fear." The room grew quiet. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably. Next came a mother who spoke of the night Morris had stopped her with her children in the back seat. "He laughed when my daughter cried," she said, her voice firm with anger. "He told me to control my family as if we were a problem, not people." Her words hit harder than any report. Her pain carried more weight than any file. The people in the chamber nodded, their faces tight with shared understanding. Angela presented body camera footage next. The projector flickered, showing moments of arrogance, unnecessary force, and mocking words. Morris shifted in his seat, his face red. Each clip revealed more than excuses could cover. Each second tore down the walls he had built around himself. The evidence was undeniable. The truth was no longer hidden in paperwork, it was visible to all. When it was Morris's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his voice unsteady. He tried to claim he had been misunderstood, that he was only doing his duty. But every word sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. His lawyer urged him to stay calm, but the frustration in his eyes betrayed him. He looked at the crowd, at Angela, at the board, and realized he was fighting a battle he could not win. Angela, in her closing words, stood tall. "This is not about punishing one man," she said firmly. "This is about protecting the integrity of the badge. If we allow racism and arrogance to hide behind authority, then the badge loses meaning. If we ignore truth, we betray every citizen who depends on us. The people deserve better. The law deserves better. And this city deserves better." Her words carried through the chamber like a bell. The silence that followed was powerful. The board members exchanged glances, their pens scribbling notes, their faces heavy with responsibility. The citizens in the crowd leaned forward, hanging on every breath. Everyone knew the decision was close. Everyone knew the moment of truth was near. That night, as Morris sat in his apartment, he stared at his badge on the table. Once it had been a source of pride. Now it looked like a symbol of his downfall. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and for the first time in his career, he questioned whether he had ever deserved it at all. His pride, his arrogance, his cruelty, they had brought him here. And the woman who stood against him had shown the world what real authority looked like. The city waited for the board's decision. The streets buzzed with talk. Would the officer be stripped of his badge? Would justice finally be served? For many, this was more than a case. This was proof that change was possible, that voices long ignored could finally be heard. Angela Brooks had carried those voices into the light, and the people stood with her, ready for the final answer. Asterisk. The hearing room was silent as the review board returned from their recess. The citizens leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the long wooden table where the decision would be read. Reporters clutched their pens, cameras stood ready, and even the officers who had once looked untouchable now sat still, waiting for the words that would decide everything. The air was heavy, every breath carrying expectation. Angela Brooks sat calmly at her seat, her hands folded neatly on the desk. Her face showed no nerves, only resolve. She had done her work, gathered the truth, and presented it clearly. Now it was in the hands of the board. She knew no matter what they announced, the city had already changed. People had spoken. The silence had been broken. That could not be undone. Across the room, Daniel Morris shifted uncomfortably. His face was pale, his hands restless, his jaw clenched tight. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his uniform and his badge gave him endless protection. But tonight, the uniform felt heavy, and the badge in his pocket burned against his chest. He glanced around and saw no allies. The faces staring back at him were not filled with support, but with judgment. The chairperson of the board cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of authority. After reviewing the evidence, the testimonies, and the conduct of Officer Daniel Morris, this board finds that his actions violated the code of service. His behavior demonstrated consistent abuse of authority, bias in judgment, and misconduct unbecoming of an officer. Effective immediately, Daniel Morris is stripped of his badge and dismissed from the police department. The words echoed like thunder. For a moment, the room stayed silent. Then, a wave of gasps and whispers broke out. Some clapped softly. Others let out heavy sighs of relief. Mothers held their children tighter, young men and women exchanged looks of hope, and reporters scribbled furiously, eager to send the news out to the city. The decision was final. Justice had been delivered. Morris lowered his head. His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. The same badge he had once displayed with arrogance, the same badge he thought gave him power, now felt like nothing more than a piece of metal. He placed it on the table, his eyes avoiding everyone in the room. For the first time in his life, he had no words, no excuses, no shield left. He was no longer an officer. He was just a man, humiliated by the truth he could not escape. Angela rose slowly. She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with calm certainty. "This is what accountability looks like," she said softly. "Not revenge, not hate, just truth." Her words were not only for him, but for everyone in the chamber. They carried through the room, leaving behind a silence more powerful than any applause. Outside, the city erupted with noise. People filled the streets, sharing the news. Strangers hugged, neighbors shook hands, and families spoke of a new beginning. It wasn't just about one man losing his badge, it was about hope that the system could change. It was about the belief that justice could rise above arrogance. And at the center of it all stood Angela Brooks, the woman who had faced arrogance with strength and proved what real authority looked like. In the following weeks, reforms began. Training programs were updated, oversight grew stronger, and more. Citizens came forward with stories they had once kept hidden. Angela worked tirelessly, turning those voices into action. She knew one case would not erase years of pain, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all people needed to believe. Again, Morris, meanwhile, faded from the headlines. He lived quietly, away from the uniform that had once defined him. He carried the weight of humiliation like a shadow he could not outrun. Every time he looked at the empty space where his badge used to be, he remembered the woman who had stood against him, calm and unshaken, and the truth he could never deny. One evening, Angela walked home through the quiet streets. The sky glowed with the colors of sunset, painting the city in shades of gold and red. Children played nearby, their laughter filling the air. A mother waved at her gratefully. An older man nodded with respect as she passed. She returned their gestures with a warm smile. She had not just ended one man's career, she had restored hope to countless others. And that was the true measure of her victory. The war had ended not with anger, but with justice. Not with pride, but with truth. And in the heart of the city, people finally understood that authority was not about the badge on a chest or the uniform on a body. Authority was about responsibility, about serving with honor, about protecting without prejudice. And thanks to Angela Brooks, they had seen it with their own eyes.